Hi, and thank you for tuning in to the Daily Dose for Spiritual Growth. We are starting a brand new week. Happy Labor Day. Maybe many of you are off work today, enjoying some time with your family or friends. If you are working, thank you. Some people need to work to make the world go round. So we appreciate you, whatever your day looks like today. But I appreciate mostly that you have taken some time to tune into this devotional online and to just spend some time with the Lord. And that's what we're going to do. Yesterday in church at Shrewsbury Assembly, if you were with us, Pastor talked about Daniel's chapter 8 and 9 and really challenged all of us to respond to the circumstances of life with prayer and fasting. It was such a challenging time. And so I thought it would be cool this week to really emphasize different prayers in the Bible. You know, we read about prayer throughout the Bible. Jesus obviously himself gave as such an example of the importance of prayer, right? If there's anyone who didn't need to pray, it would be God himself in human form as Jesus. But he modeled for us that prayer is necessary for our life to constantly stay connected to the Father. And so we may get into a prayer of Jesus's this week, but today I want to start with a prayer from the Old Testament. This prayer is given specifically by a woman named Hannah. Now, I don't know if you're familiar with her story. Hannah's story we find in 1 Samuel. She's actually the mother of Samuel. But the first chapter of that book starts with her in anguish because she's barren. She has no children, and we find her crying out to God in prayer. If you go ahead and begin in 1 Samuel chapter 1, verse 9, it says this: Once they had finished eating and drinking in Shiloh, Hannah stood up. Now Eli the priest was sitting on his chair by the doorpost of the Lord's house. In her deep anguish, Hannah prayed to the Lord, weeping bitterly. And she made a vow, saying, Lord Almighty, if you will only look on your servant's misery and remember me, and not forget about your servant, but give her a son, then I will give him to the Lord for all the days of his life, and no razor will ever be used on his head. If you jump forward just a little bit into verse 15, we see again that she's praying, and she's actually describes it earlier that she's praying in her head, that her lips are moving. It's like she's mouthing words, but Eli, the priest who observed this, didn't hear anything, so he recognized that she was praying in her mind but mouthing the words with her mouth, and he actually thought she was drunk. And he addresses this with her, but in verse 15, she says, Not so, my lord, Hannah replied. I am a woman who is deeply troubled. I have not been drinking wine or beer. I was pouring out my soul to the Lord. I want to pause there before we get into the prayer that I want to read today, which comes in chapter 2. But when you think of your prayer life, what I mean by that is when you think about your interaction with God through prayer, it's not just a momentary experience, but really it becomes a lifestyle. According to the word of God, that's the goal, is that we would be in an attitude of prayer at all times. But when you think about your connection with God through prayer, your connection with God with talking and listening and that communication, what type of prayers do you most often give? We're going to talk about many different styles today or this week, I should say, as we look into the Word of God. But here we see a woman who's going through a difficult circumstance. There's a longing in her heart that hasn't yet been fulfilled, longing for a child. And it gives us so poignantly her despair, her anguish, her troubled spirit over this. And we don't see her just candy coating prayers to God. Hey, God, if you want, I'd like a baby. But we actually see her pouring out her soul, the word of God says, that she's going to God and sharing her pain and sharing her feelings with him because she trusts that God is just. Is that how you pray? When you talk to God, have you found, if you reflect on past conversations, that you come off a little bit more superficial? Are you a little bit more structured in your prayers? Maybe you have a repetitive prayer you pray. Are you maybe mainly just focused on praising God and honoring God? Or do you ever have times where you just talk raw, openly, vulnerably with your despair? You know, we all face difficult times in life. We all face circumstances beyond our control regularly. We all face challenging moments where maybe we feel like the world is crashing in. And how do you respond in those moments? If you were in service or watched online yesterday, Pastor challenged us in those moments that our first response should be to go to God and to talk to him about it. And that's what we see Hannah doing. What's beautiful, and if you read the rest of chapter 1, you recognize that the Lord granted her request, gave her a son, and she named him Samuel. And she followed through on her promise. She dedicated him to the Lord, and he spent years of his life serving in the home of Eli the priest. With that, though, we see in chapter 2 her response of prayer. And I'm just going to read a few verses. You can go and read the whole chapter on your own, but this is what it says in verse 1 of chapter 2. It says, "Then Hannah prayed and said, 'My heart rejoices in the Lord. In the Lord my horn is lifted high. My mouth boasts over my enemies, for I delight in your deliverance. There is no one holy like the Lord. There is no one besides you. There is no rock like our God.'" I'm just going to stop there. You can read the rest on your own. You see, when Hannah saw the Lord do a miracle in her life, she boasted about her God and she went to God in praise. And as you read through the rest of that prayer, not only did she boast about a warning almost to her enemies, like, hey, trust in God, but she also reflected on his goodness throughout her life and others. That's where I want us to land today. Think about what God has already done. Think about what God is doing, because you may be going through a very difficult circumstance right now, but let us be reminded and challenged by Hannah's prayer that not only can we thank God for what he just did, but we can also take moments to reflect on what he's done. Because as we do that, it changes our heart posture from maybe fear or worry or anxiety or stress or trying to fix things on our own or despair to reminding us and centering us on the God who is in control. Maybe you're going through a situation that seems impossible, but you remember that God has done the impossible. And if you look back at your life and you're like, I don't know, look to the word of God. There is example after example after example of God shutting the mouths of lions, of God parting the seas, of God healing bodies. Be reminded of what God has done so it can encourage you for what he is going to do next. Let's take some time today to thank God, reflect, and honor God through our prayer life. Hey, I want to thank you so much for tuning in today, and I hope to see you again tomorrow for another daily dose for spiritual growth.